Toward a Modern America, the 1920s, Chapter 24. What we're going to do this time is do something a little bit different. The chapter isn't overly long, but there is just so much information in here. And I hate to have you go through the whole lecture, then we watch your YouTube. So what we're going to do is we're going to split this into 2 PowerPoints, each one a little bit shorter than one big long one, of course. And I'll take this particular section through the Harlem Renaissance, and then we'll stop long enough to view some YouTubes on the era. And then we'll come back and talk about business. So don't panic. It's not going to be unusually long. It's just going to be in different sections. In May of 1920, at the height of the Red Scare, police arrested 2 Italian immigrants alleged to have participated in a Massachusetts robbery at a factory in which a guard had been killed. The accused were Niccolo Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartholomew Vincetti. Yes, they were anarchists who hoped for a society without government and churches and private property. They saw violence as a very appropriate means for enacting social change, but very little evidence linked them to the crime. Eyewitness testimony was contradictory. Other evidence was disputed, but nevertheless, in the anti-radical and anti-immigrant atmosphere of the Red Scare, their conviction was inevitable. When the men were found guilty and sentenced to death, their multiple appeals garnered international attention and sympathy. A movement to save their lives attracted the support from many, including those here in the United States. A future Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, he was trying to help them. The governor of Massachusetts responded to protests by appointing a commission headed by Abbott Lawrence Law, Harvard University's president, and also a longtime official of the Immigration Restriction League. But the commission upheld the verdict and the death sentences. And on August 23, 1927, Sacco and Vincetti were executed by the electric chair. And Times Square was like a holiday. As you can see, the thousands and thousands of people packed, waiting to hear the word that they had been executed. But the Sacco-Vincetti case kind of exposed much about America in the 1920s. From the Red Scare's erosion of civil liberties to the cultural divisions sparked by immigration, and the seemingly triumph of capital over labor in the decades of apparent prosperity. And even though the 20s signaled its innovation in music, it's been called the Jazz Age, and the Roaring 20s, it's an age of sexually liberating women and roaring stock market and consumer goods. But not all Americans welcomed this emerging secular commercials culture. Some feared ethnic and racial diversity, and what they saw as moral degradation of urban life. And they began to express their apprehension in anti-immigrant and religious sentiment. The chief business of the American people is business, President Calvin Coolidge stated. Economic expansion, partnership between business and government, and business values seemed greater in the 20s than in any previous point in American history. And after the post-war recession receded in 1920, the decade was one of extraordinary prosperity. Productivity and output skyrocketed as new industries such as chemicals and electronics grew, and older industries began to adopt Ford's moving assembly line. And automobiles so stimulated the economic growth that auto factories, not iron and steel mills, came to embody the American industrial power. Car production tripled in the decade. General Motors surpassed Ford, and by 1929, 50% of all American families owned a car. And of course, the auto industry sparked the growth of steel, rubber, oil production, road construction, kind of umbrella industries, and in all economic sectors, and even promoted tourism and the expansion of the suburbs. In this decade alone, America's multinational corporations also extended their penetration of international markets, and the dollar became the most important currency in world trade. American industry still is leading other nations in output. Consumerism, good word. It simply means the act of consuming. And prior to this time, when we'd been a little bit more thrifty, if we wanted to buy something, we saved our money to pay cash for it. In the 1920s, consumer goods for the first time became obtainable by most Americans. And consumer goods is basically defined as something that's not necessary, like groceries or rent. But they're new shoes, they're going to the movies, they're buying a second dress that you don't need. With goods made available by something called credit and the installment buying plans. I mean, $1 down and $1 a week. You could buy a vacuum cleaner, you could buy a new telephone, you could buy a washing machine and a refrigerator, and all these things are going to transform your daily life. But of course, advertising and marketing professionals soon found ways to compel us to purchase items from these new industrial cornucopia. And Americans began spending more time on leisure activities, from vacations to going to sports activities like football games and baseball games, and going to things called the movies. Of course, radios and phonographs brought mass entertainment into the private homes and birthed a new celebrity culture. I mean, you could sit in Owensboro, Kentucky, and you could hear on the radio a big band playing at a hotel in Chicago. You could sit in Kentucky and you could hear the crack of a bat as somebody hit a ball at a ball game in San Francisco. It was wonderful. And some people said that our new society is emerging in which Americans are valuing their standard of living above all else. Because Americans' willingness to amass enormous debt in order to purchase consumer goods, it seemingly replaces the old 19th century values of thrift and self-denial. Work, once seen as a point of pride in your skill or collective empowerment in trade unions, now only means a way to pursue the fulfillment through consumerism and entertainment. But there is a downside. And I didn't, oh my word, I apologize. Despite the abundance of the mass consumer society, the fruits of economic expansion were very unequally distributed. Real wages rose by only 1/3 between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at more than twice that rate. And economic concentration continued, with a smaller number of firms and banks controlling more of the industry and finance. By early 1929, the share of the national income of the wealthiest 5% of American families exceeded that of the bottom 60%. The majority of families, of course, had no savings, and 40% of Americans lived in poverty level, below poverty level. At that time, $2,000 a year, you could supposedly support a family of 4. And you're living less than that. And some of them had less than $1,000 a year, and you can't even buy milk for your children on that. And these people were unable to enjoy the new consumer economy, of course, but improved productivity allowed goods to be made with fewer workers. And while employment grew in some sectors, such as the professions, retail and education and manufacturing employment began to drop for the first time in American history. Deindustrialization began in the old industrial Northeast as businesses moved south to take advantage of cheaper and non-union labor. Sound familiar? Farmers were also excluded from prosperity because the American agriculture had reached its zenith in World War I, when Europe's need for food and government policies had kept farm prices high. But increasing mechanization and the use of fertilizers and pesticides, it elevated the output even as world demand stagnated, steadily reducing farm incomes and forcing tens of thousands of farm foreclosures. In the 1920s, for the first time in United States history, the number of farms and farmers declined. Extractive industries like mining and lumber also suffered from the overproduction to the world markets. And even before the 1930s, rural Americans were suffering from economic depression. And although high unemployment crippled much of Europe in the 1920s, America's high wages, efficient industry, and mass consumption projected a magical image of America. I mean, we were the nation of wealth and permanent prosperity. The Committee on Public Information's propaganda campaign during World War I persuaded advertisers that it was possible to sway the minds of the whole population. And many businesses established public relations departments to defend their corporate business practices and try to win over this very distrusting public. And they successfully changed public attitudes toward Wall Street. Because congressional hearings from 1912 to 1914, held by a Louisiana Congressman, Arsenio Pujo, had exposed the big Wall Street banks' manipulation of stock prices, and it strengthened popular views that investors were fleeced in the stock market. By the 1920s, however, with stock prices rising, the market gained more investors. And by 1928, 1.5 million Americans owned stock, more than any previous time in the American history. With the defeat of the 1919 labor revolt and the dissolution of the wartime regulations, businesses used the language of Americanism and industrial freedom against the unions. Some corporations in the 1920s adopted a new style of management called welfare capitalism, in which they offered employees private pensions, medical insurance plans, job security, and leisure programs. And of course, these businesses celebrated their attention to the human factor in industry. But more employers adopted the American plan, whose basis was the open shop, a workplace free of government regulation and unions, except in some cases, company unions that were created and controlled by the management. They believed collective bargaining infringed on the liberties of the management, and argued that prosperity depended on complete freedom for business. In other words, government laissez-faire, hands off. Public relation campaigns linked unionism with socialism, its sinister foreigners. And even progressive companies hired strikebreakers and detectives and blacklisted union members to prevent or defeat unions and strikes. So in this hostile environment, unions lost more than 2 million members. And unions finally capitulated to employer demands in order to prevent their annihilation. But like unions, feminists tried to adapt to the new conservative atmosphere of the 20s. Suffrage in 1920 ended the ties of solidarity that had united the various groups of women reformers, and black feminists now insisted that the movement to demand the enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South, but white activists offered a little support. The long-standing divisions between the two competing conceptions of women's freedom, one based on motherhood, the other on the individual autonomy and the right to work, now took shape in a debate over something called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Advocated by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, the proposed amendment would eliminate all legal distinctions on account of sex. Paul argued that now that women had their vote, they no longer needed special legal protections, and they needed equal access to employment, education, and any other opportunities. But women reformers who supported the mother's pension and laws limiting a woman's work hours, which the ERA threatened to dismantle, vehemently opposed the ERA. Every major women's organization other than the National Women's Party opposed it. So the ERA campaign failed. And in 1929, Congress repealed the Shepard-Tower Act of 1921, which had offered federal assistance to programs for infant and child health. The pre-war feminists on personal freedom blossomed in a growing consumer society, and women's liberation became a lifestyle promoted by advertisers and mass entertainment. Detached from the political or social radicalism, sexual freedom now meant individual autonomy or personal rebellion. And the young single flapper who smoked and danced and sported short hair and skirts, and she used birth control devices, came to symbolize the new woman. And here is a look at the working attire. As you can see, we finally got rid of those girdles and those long petticoats and cut her hair off. It's just phenomenal. And of course, in the day of Prohibition, you had to have your flask. And of course, this flapper's got a leg flask. Flapper's dancing the Charleston, and we got bathing beauties. Look at those girls. Excuse me. But progressivism disintegrated in the 1920s. Government success in creating mass hysteria during the war appeared to erode the foundation of democracy. The radical, self-directed citizen was gone. Sigmund Freud pointed out to the unconscious and instinctual behavior. IQ tests seemed to show that many Americans were mentally unfit for self-government. Oh, I forgot to do this. Coming to the 1920s, fashion and public image placed an even greater stress on females and their role in society. In fact, this became a personal struggle for women that began to affect their self-image as well as their view in the public eye. But no matter how you looked at it, the 1920s were an exciting time as women were granted new rights and fulfilled new roles in society. Even though women were now redefining their role and their place, they still had to fit into a mold, and this mold demanded that women fit a certain body image. And fashion during this decade reflected this expectation. Even though women during the 20s focused more on personal image than the generation before them, the modern woman was surfacing, and many different aspects of the women that developed during this time can be seen in today's women. The women of the 20s were flooded with pressure and expectations to be thin, to control their appetite and their weight. And the beginning of mass advertising encouraged this behavior and seemed to add even more pressure. One must fit a certain type in order to have friends and be socially acceptable. So, really, you're putting pressure on yourself to conform to an ideal thinner figure in order to fit into society and not be looked down upon as an outcast. So, for women, the need to be thin and beautiful was important. They needed to feel loved and accepted by others. And this need is very much alive and apparent in our society today in the 21st century. So for the first time in history, perhaps, women became extremely conscious of their body shape and their body image. The traditional hourglass corset was cast aside for the rubber girdle to retract the hips. The fashion industry set new standards for a woman's body. The new luxury of mass-produced clothing led to assigning body sizes for a woman and defining a certain body type. Before, clothes were made to fit a person's body. Now, pre-made or store-bought dresses required the body to conform to the dress. And this created a new idea of the coveted thin, swaying away from the traditional hourglass. But the fashion for women during the 20s emphasized a boyish figure that lacked hips, breasts, and a defined waist, as demonstrated in that photo. The traditional hourglass casket, as I said, was cast aside for the rubber girdle. And this imposed slim and thin figures, and it was what to guilt a woman into extreme dieting. Corsets were standard even during pregnancy. The former belief that that was a sign of wealth and health and happiness was very quickly replaced by the need to constantly reduce. The need to become thinner and slimmer was apparent in the 1920s and is still alive today for the women in the 21st century. Exercise and diet kept the young ladies slim and trim. You know, I fortunately wasn't around when they were doing those kind of exercise things. They were constantly comparing themselves to models in magazines, which we do today. In the past, women thought to be weaker, and they're now judged on appearance. And is this an independent woman when she has to depend on the public image? So what's the public perception of this flapper? Like I say, the women had changed drastically in the 20s. They had shortened their skirts and bobbed their hair and took to wearing makeup and drinking and smoking and driving automobiles and indulging in heavy petting with their boyfriends. The emphasis was on girls being pals with the men, doing everything that the men did. Golf, tennis, and swimming were all popular activities, and the women were supposed to share the interest of their male friends. Interest in careers and social reform declined. There were fewer women in the workforce in 1930 than there had been in 1910. And the idea of staying single and devoting yourself to a career just went totally out of fashion. Women professionals were concentrated almost entirely in 4 areas: teaching, nursing, social work, and libraries. The new women of the pre-World War I era, who had grown up believing that they had a duty to make the world a better place, they were they were shocked by the quality of the new generation. Jane Addams of Hull House said the girls were astonishingly putting an emphasis on sex, which was very disquieting, and gave the unique social contribution the uneducated married woman had made for the last 50 years. Some people thought the 20s were the bleakest years of their professional career. And some looked out over the sleek heads of female students when you were a teacher and decided that the only generation of women that ever found themselves was my generation. But American women's most celebrated job was consumer-in-chief. Today's woman gets what she wants, enthused an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune. The vote, slim sheaths of silk to replace the voluminous petticoats, glassware in sapphire blue or glowing amber, the right to a career, the right to have soap to match her bathroom color scheme. Thus we leave the world of the flapper. Harlem Renaissance. The migration to the north brought a rise in the black middle class. There was also a change in attitude toward assimilation into white American culture. Large congregations of blacks who had been moved from the South and lured by opportunities in teaching and the arts found that they were the last hired and the first fired. Jobs were hard to come by. But many found employment performing on the Harlem streets at house parties, bordellos, or just about anywhere for a meal or $1 or $2. In the beginning of the Renaissance, there were 3 separate but easily identifiable means by which an urban black could climb onto the bandwagon of Main Street America. First, there was a sudden appreciation for anything that was black. That was the main idea of the Harlem Renaissance. Second, for poorer blacks, Marcus Garvey led a Back to African movement, which represented a new renewed sense of racial pride. And third, the middle-class blacks followed a milder kind of nationalism, which followed the philosophy of the NAACP. But above all, blacks had this idea of the Renaissance in their mind. Philosophies differed on how to achieve it, so once again, blacks were divided much the same way they were divided during the slavery days. The house servant, field servant division from the old days now divided the urban blacks into groups usually headed by professional men such as doctors and lawyers. And leadership in the community was now based on acquisition rather than on free versus slave condition. So who were these people? And what places were associated? And what effect did it have on the development? Well, musicians gravitated to New York for various reasons. It had begun during the late 20s and 30s, and it helped to firmly establish New York as the mecca for black music. And although these musicians were really great, it is important to remember that the mainstream of the Harlem Renaissance did not approve of this new type of music, and many did not frequent clubs or even associate with the big names of jazz. But in spite of the reaction to such musicals as Shuffle Along, known as the liveliest, most brilliant musical of the time, and stars such as Josephine Baker, who later became a star of the Folies Bergère in Paris, and Bojangles Robinson made a lasting impression on American. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, was the editor of the magazine The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP. And we start seeing writing. He offered money for contests and offered you to ask you to write stories and things. And you could write anything. You could write about your life. You could write a fictional story, write poetry. But Harlem became the black cultural capital. And like I said, the magazine Opportunity sponsored literary contests also. The Crisis kept publishing black writing. And the writings were very diverse. No one style. I mean, they wrote poetry and stories and biography. For instance, Langston Hughes, known as the Shakespeare of Harlem, he was a poet, and he wrote about black pride. Jesse Redmond Fawcett was a novelist, and his most famous book was The Blacker the Berry. Cunty Cullen was a poet. He was a minister's son and happened to be son-in-law to W.E.B. Du Bois. Charles Gibbon and Paul Robinson, stage actors. Eugene O'Neill, who was white, began to write about the black heritage and the black family, and he wrote All God's Children Got Wings. It's a play, and black authors are writing plays and performing the plays. Or the plays are being performed by blacks. And of course, the best known is the musical of the day, Jazz, Blues, and Spirituals. Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, written and performed by a man named Henry Thacker Burlew. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Now, Mr. Burlew was a free northern black, and his mother employer, she worked as a maid in the home of a really wealthy lady, and she allowed him to attend musicals. And now, back in those days, we didn't have television and things like that, so if you had the money, you would invite someone to come into your home and perform. And Henry, being allowed to listen, developed a love of music very early, and he was so good he won a scholarship to the National Conservative Music, and then he began writing spirituals. Of course, W.C. Handy, and I'm sure that every one of you listening to this knows who W.C. Handy is, because we have a festival over there in Henderson every year, right? Barbecue Festival. He's called the father of the blues. And the irony is, well, I think their barbecue's okay, but it doesn't compare to Kentucky's barbecue, Owensboro's barbecue, but that's beside the point. Mr. Handy wasn't born in Kentucky. He wasn't even born in Indiana. His parents had been slaves, and his dad was very, very rigid in what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Now, Mr. Handy had an ear for music, and he loved listening to people, but his dad was so strict, he thought anybody that played a musical instrument could be found in a brothel or something like that, and it just wasn't going to happen. But he got a job and saved up money, and he brought a guitar. He brought it home. He was so proud of it. And his daddy made him take it back and get his money and use the money he got from the guitar and buy a dictionary. He said the dictionary would do him more good than the guitar ever would. Well, he graduated high school and went down to Birmingham and took a teacher's test and became a teacher. And it didn't take him long to realize he didn't make any money teaching. So he left teaching and went to work at the steel mills. And while he was there, he taught himself how to play, and he started playing in a band. And he gets married later on, but right now he's not married. So he and his guys decided they want to go to the Chicago State Fair. And they save the money and they play along the way and go up the Mississippi to Chicago. They get there and they discover they're at the wrong year. They wasn't going to be happening until the next year. So they come back down the river and begin to split up. And Mr. Handy wound up in a little town called Evansville, Indiana. He got a job with a band, and the band was hired one time to go across the river to a little town called Henderson. They were going to play at a barbecue festival. Now, it's at this barbecue festival that Mr. Handy met his wife. She was from Kentucky. They got married and had many children, and then he went into Indiana, and he never came back to Kentucky. But he's called the father of the blues. And if you get a chance to go to the BBQ festival, I think it's in June, it's free, and they've got great music, and they have different jazz bands and blues bands coming in and playing. And you just bring your lawn chair. Now, if you want to buy some barbecue with it, that's fine, or you can take your own. It's a good, reasonably priced afternoon of entertainment, and it lasts almost all week. But in jazz, we had Scott Joplin and Jelly Roll Morton, and of course Louis Armstrong, one of my favorites. The singers, Ella Fitzgerald and Pearl Bailey, and of course Marian Anderson, the black opera singer, which was not allowed to sing at Constitutional Hall because she was black. So Mrs. Roosevelt got mad and resigned her membership in the DAR and let her work with her husband and made arrangements for her to sing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, Toni Morrison was made even more famous by Oprah Winfrey because of her book Beloved. And a lot of times, you may have to take it to read it. It's very strange. And I know Oprah even acted out the part in a TV movie, which I didn't like. Now, Zora Neale Hurston was a ringtail toot. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I think that been a time or two that Professor Brown has had her English class read it. She was something else, big woman. But the place to be in Harlem was at the Savoy and the Cotton Club. In this place, originally the Cotton Club was owned by gangsters, and it was famous for Broadway shows. And Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway found a home there for many years. The all-black entertainers, and no blacks were allowed as guests. It closed in 1925 by federal agents for violating prohibition, but it was soon reopened. Closed again a couple of years later, and then it moved. But before being named the Cotton Club, it was known as the Douglas Theater. The Savoy Ballroom was the largest ballroom in Harlem, and it occupied an entire second floor. The major feature of the Savoy was the Battle of the Bands, which usually began with businessmen and people coming in to do, well, what do you call it when y'all get together? Have a, what's that word I'm looking for? Spontaneous, I can't think of it right now, but it's when y'all get together and play. Zora Neale Hurston called the white people who went to these clubs the niggeretti. Well, she meant it to be disrespectful. But it seemed like the white people flocked to these clubs. So we had the jazz and the blues. And by the 1950s, you've got rhythm and blues fused with country music, and something became known as rock and roll. And of course, Elvis Presley. In the 60s, we have soul, which becomes a symbol of the black identity. You got Motown. In 1970s, you had disco. And that music was aimed at both blacks and whites. It was heard at nightclubs, and I must admit I did my fair share of that. And finally, a new sound can be heard in New York. Three young men took an instrumental accompaniment along with fast talking rhythms to New Jersey and recorded rappers. Now, rap is a kind of style of speaking with rudimentary background music, and it's usually a percussion extending with an occasional guitar chord. It's really more of a protest, getting it out there. It's become a very viable music style, and I can't say I'm really fond of it, but nevertheless. So the question is, did the Harlem Renaissance end in the 1929 when the stock market crashed? Yes and no. Money became very tight. Some of them lived on like Zora Neale Hurston and some of the other writers. They got into a program in the New Deal, which we'll discuss next chapter. But it had a resurgence again in the 30s too. So what I'm going to do is end right here, and we're going to go and look a couple of views of the YouTubes to get a real feel of the era.